Today, I am joined by Shaun Rein. Shaun Rein is the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, the world's leading strategic market intelligence firm focused on China. He's the author of the new book, The Split: Finding Opportunities in China's Economy in the New World Order. In this interview, we discuss what the West gets wrong about China, the complexities of the Chinese economy, and where opportunities for growth lie in the Chinese economy. So Shaun, why do you move to China?
So Keith, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for making time after you just spoke with Kishore Mubani. So I'm very honored to be with such a illustrious company on your podcast. Thank you. So I've been in China for 27 years. I just turned 47. And most of the other 20 years, I was actually living in the United States. I was born in a small city called Concord, New Hampshire. The total population is about 35,000. Which I think is probably smaller than the housing compound that I live in right now in Shanghai. So I'm ethnically half Chinese and I'm half Jewish. And I think I started to get interested in learning about China really in my teenage years. And it happened because I spent some time during high school living and working in the Philippines. I taught at a school called Trinity College of Quezon City in Manila. And when I was there, I was fortunate to have a Commodore, which is one of the heads of the Filipino Navy, be my mentor. And this was in the mid-90s, and we used to talk about what's going to happen in the world in the future. And he said to me, Shaun, don't listen to the Americans. We need to understand what's going to happen with the rise of China. Because China's getting strong, and this is something that everybody in the South Asia is going to have to deal with, and what we're going to have to deal with, especially in the Philippines and the South China Sea. So he recommended that I learn about China. And then I spent some time after high school teaching English in Bundang, South Korea. And when I was there meeting with military and business leaders, they said the exact same thing as the Commodore, my mentor. And they said, Shaun, China's going to wake. We need to learn how to deal with China's rise more from a business standpoint rather than a military one in South Korea's case. And so I went to China and I studied at Nankai University, and I found, Pete, that everything that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times told you about China was wrong. It was completely different from what I saw on the ground. In the New York Times, they said that the Chinese people wanted democracy. You got to remember, this was just after the 1989 Tiananmen incident, and that the Chinese were angry at the government. Instead, I found an electric optimism coursing through the country. People there said the lives of our children is going to be better than the lives of our children. They're very supportive of Zhu Rongji, who was the prime minister at the time, and a lot of his economic reforms. And there's just this sense of optimism. There's a real can-do attitude, very similar actually to the American can-do attitude. And so I decided to spend and dedicate my life to learning about China. I think naively, actually, at the time, I originally wanted to be a diplomat for America. My dream job has always been to be Secretary of State, or I wanted to be a professor of Chinese politics and international relations. And things happened, and I ended up coming into China for business, predominantly because I found that the American foreign policy establishment in the 90s wasn't interested in learning about the real China. They didn't want to hear that the population in China was supportive of Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin at the time, or that there was optimism there. What the foreign policy establishment at the time wanted was to figure out, how do we get China to develop into a liberal democracy? How do we get them to overthrow the CPC, or the Communist Party of China? And so I guess there's kind of a long-winded answer, but I came to China somewhat by accident, mostly because the neighbors, the political and business leaders in countries neighboring China told me I needed to learn the real China. And I went into it, thought I could help America as a diplomat or as an academic, but I soon realized they didn't care about the truth. It was the business community that wanted to know the truth about China because their overriding goal was making money. And they wanted to know, could they make money in China? And I've been helping companies for the last 19 years as the founder of the China Market Research Group figure out how to profit from China's economic and political terms.
there was one myth that you previously tried to debunk, which was that China was a copycat economy. Can you maybe elaborate as to why you think that myth is wrong?
Right, I think you bring up an interesting idea. I am American. I'm a red-blooded American. I love the United States. Like I said, I love to be Secretary of State. I've even thought about running for Senate, but I have lived most of my life in China. And there aren't that many Americans who came as early as I did, who I would say would have professional credibility. A lot of the people who came in the 1980s were sort of running away from the United States. They weren't coming here because they thought China was a great opportunity. They came here because there's nothing for them to do in the US. So I think I have a different perspective in many ways growing up in China. I came here as a teenager. And so I grew with the ride of optimism of that Chinese kid. But at the end of the day, I'm still American. So I've sort of been able to bounce on both sides, understand both cultures. And so one of the myths that you bring up is that a lot of Americans have said Chinese are immoral. They're all about buying counterfeit products, or they're all about copycatting. And what I found in the development was the Chinese weren't immoral. They just wanted to buy, or arguably, they just wanted to have Gucci and Louis Vuitton products and look good, but they didn't have the money to buy the real item. But as soon as they were able to buy the real item, they bought the real thing. And that's why you see Arnault, the founder of LVMH, is one of the world's richest people, or $200-300 billion, because Chinese consumers have now become the largest buyer of luxury products in the world, from Cartier, Dunhill, and now to Hermes. The Chinese consumers buying to the point now that you don't really see pirated products sold on the street in China anymore. The government has really clamped down on it. I actually haven't seen a store on the street in China selling pirated items probably for 5-10 years. You still get it sometimes on the internet players like an Alibaba or Douyin, but it's not front and center. The government is clearly trying to crack down on it. But, I was just in New York City a few months ago, and you see pirated items all over Times Square. There was rampant piracy 20 years ago, but I think they're taking an outdated look at what China is. And it wasn't really a function of immorality or being Chinese. It was more a function of poverty. And that's why right now Chinese are trying to buy the top product. Now, I think you asked me this question because in 2014, I wrote a book called The End of Copycat China, where I was arguing two parts. One was that Chinese wanted to buy real items, which I've proven true. And the second was that Chinese would become an innovative nation. And that was a lot more controversial at the time. Most people in Silicon Valley in 2010, when I wrote the book, thought I was crazy. And they said Chinese are just going to steal software, copycat it, and they're not going to be able to build anything new. But 10 years after the book was released, I think I was clear I was right. Some of the most innovative companies in the world are coming from China. China has taken a digital-first mobile phone ecosystem, and it's a cashless society. You see companies like Douyin, like Tencent, like Alibaba, that are years ahead of their American counterparts in the United States and Europe in terms of technological innovation. When I go into the United States now, I feel like I'm going back into the dark ages when it comes to the use of mobile apps. So I think, one of the problems that businesses, and certainly one of the problems that America's government has when they view China, is they're still looking at China 20 years ago. They're not looking at the reality of China today. And that's one of the biggest problems. And that's why I salute people like you that bring into their podcast to sort of tell the truth, the real situation on the ground in China, the good and the bad, because we need a more objective view to avert a 1930s, 1940s scenario, because I worry that there's a lot of military geopolitical tension that could flame into a hot war, so much because of misunderstandings and what I would say would be a lack of truth and a lack of balance and a lack of objectivity in the Western press.
I, I wanted to talk a little bit about your upcoming book, The Split. You see a lot of tension between the US and China, but it didn't have to be that way. When we look back at maybe the early 1970s when Richard Nixon started his ping-pong diplomacy, you saw a warming of relations. But now it's almost as if that in the US, in order to win votes, you have to blame or make China the boogeyman. Can you help me understand when did this split between the US and China really occur?
So I'm really frustrated, Pete. I love the United States. Like I said, I might run for Senate one day. I love China. And it's really too bad that we have this geopolitical tension. And that's why I wrote a book called The Split. The tension that's happening in the world didn't have to be this way. You know, Chinese benefit from having trade with America. And frankly, the Americans benefit from having trade with China. When you look over the last 20 years, China has been a deflationary pressure on the United States. So Americans were able to buy, Nike Air shoes, Apple iPhones at a cost that's reasonably affordable because American businesses were able to produce everything in China. Now, it's definitely true that there's some economic dislocation. In places like where J.D. Vance was raised, people did lose their factory jobs. But if you look at it, the politicians in the last 5, 10 years say that there isn't an unemployment problem. There just aren't enough workers in the United States, which is why the Democrats especially want so many of the illegal immigrants to come into the country. So when people say that China stole the job, but then they're looking for workers in the United States right now, it just doesn't make a lot of sense right now. It's very clear that America benefited both from everyday consumers and from profit margins for companies like a Walmart, like an Apple, like a Nike, from having trade with China. But let's also be equally clear that Chinese also benefit greatly from trade with the United States because they're able to get hard capital. After the disastrous Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, China was poor and they didn't have a lot of management know-how. So getting into the World Trade Organization, getting investments from American players really is what jump-started the economic miracle we've seen in China, where 800 million Chinese have been uplifted out of poverty. So from a normal, reasonable person, a pragmatic person, China and America should continue trade. And you can even see it, Keith, in that a lot of China's leaders love the United States. You see Jiang Zemin, the former president, his grandson, Alvin Zhang, who's the founder of Boyu Capital, he went to Harvard. Xi Jinping, the current president of China, his daughter also went to Harvard. They didn't send their kids to Russia. They sent them to the United States because they wanted to learn the best academic, rigorous training possible and to get closer with the United States. It's really only been, I would say, since Trump and the tariff wars in 2016, 2017, that there was such a split or break between the two countries. Trump created a lot of xenophobia. Xenophobia went mainstream in polite society in the United States and DC. It was okay all of a sudden for politicians like Ron DeSantis to say, we don't want any mainland Chinese to come to Florida school. We don't want mainland Chinese to buy property in Florida. Now that's pure racism. That's pure bigotry, saying that people who happen to be born in one country should not be allowed to buy homes or go to school. This is hearkening back to the 1882 China Exclusion Act in the United States, where unfortunately over the last 150 years, Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, have dealt with a lot of racism from the United States. And I think in the last 7 years, it's just snowballed. And what's really, I think, disconcerting for a lot of us, people like me, is that Biden, when he became president in 2020, he had a real opportunity to be a statesman. He had an opportunity to reset relations and say, you know what, the Trump era was a blip on what has really been pretty good relations since the Nixon era in the 1970s. Oh, let's get back to the previous 40 years of sometimes tense, but a symbiotic relationship between the two countries. Instead, Biden went even farther than Trump did, and it became more of a ideological struggle between the U.S. with liberal democracies on one side and China with communist or potentially arguably autocratic nations on the other side. And I think, unfortunately, it's going to be very hard for the two countries to come together. It was easier in the 1970s when America wasn't scared of China, right? In the 1970s, Chinese could barely eat. I mean, eat. I'm not even talking about meat. I'm not talking about foie gras. A lot of people were malnourished in the 1970s in China. So the Americans didn't view the Chinese as a threat. But now China is clearly the global economic superpower. It's clearly vying with the United States for position number one. So I think a lot of Americans are, in DC, the politicians are having a difficult time with the fact that China, just by existing, just by being strong powerfully, threatens American hegemony and what Tony Blinken likes to call the rule-based world order.
As I think there was this view that because China was a big market, it was a rising middle class, and you had just general uplift of over 700 million people out of poverty. So it became a very valuable proposition to a lot of American companies going into China. And when you detail detail in the book, the split, you talk about the fact that these opportunities may not be as obvious, right? So what are some of the opportunities that were there maybe 10 years ago but are no longer there? That, if you're a foreign company looking to enter China, maybe this is not the market for you.
If you look at it, 10, 20 years ago, China was such a burgeoning, booming market that everybody had to be in China. Basically, there was a lot of political risk from the Chinese side. There was a lot of protectionism. There was a lot of corruption. And there was then, if you're in the technology sector, a lot of piracy. There was a lot of problems and roadblocks and challenges to doing business in China. But the allure of the market outweighed any of the costs. And so for companies that invested heavily in China, they made real money, right? China has become the largest or second largest market in the world for ports, for Mercedes, for BMW, for Nike, for Starbucks. And importantly, China was buying about $300 billion US a year of semiconductor equipment and other technology from the United States. So Qualcomm generated 66% of its global revenue from China. Texas Instruments generated 44% of its global revenue from China. That all hit a wall with first Trump and then Biden. And you can see that Intel is tottering on the brink of a takeover. Qualcomm might acquire Intel, and that's largely because Intel and Qualcomm both can't sell their high-end technology to China. And you've seen all of the sanctions on China have created Chinese companies like Huawei, like SMEs, to rise in innovation so that they can compete with that's United States technology brand. So that's the path. Now, where are we going forward? I think, unfortunately, the reality is a lot of American companies are saying it's no longer worth investing in China and trying to expand. They're not taking away their operations. They're not reducing their operations. They're just not making new investments into the country because they're worried about the political risk. And it's not the political risk. It's not the corruption from the Chinese side anymore. It's now the political risk from the American side. So in the opening chapter of my book, The Split, I talk about a high-end American technology company that sold to a local government in China. And the local government paid millions and millions of dollars to acquire this American technology. But suddenly the Americans decided to stop the contract. They pulled out the technology. They paid a fine to the local Chinese government because the American company is worried that the Americans would force them to close shop in China, would sanction them for having operations in China in the same way that so many companies had to close up shop in Russia after the Ukraine war started. So right now, companies need to really understand, yeah, China is a good market. It's still growing about 5% a year. The middle class, I estimate, will swell from 400 million to 800 million in the next 5-10 years. But you can't just look at macroeconomic trends anymore. You can't just look at consumer and end customer wants anymore. You now also have to look, can your business survive in such a highly charged political, geopolitical environment? And the reality piece is if you're a technology company, in semiconductors or software or anything that could be considered national security, you probably shouldn't be expanding in China right now. You should probably be looking to India. You should be looking to countries that are more closely aligned politically with the United States. Now, that's one part of it. However, there's still a lot of really good opportunities. And there's really good opportunities if you're a Singaporean company or a Malaysian company or a company from the global south. And I think that there's going to be newly emerging opportunities if you're a European or a Japanese company, if you decide to stop this de-risking ridiculousness that Ursula von der Leyen wants, and you move closer to China's economic orbit. Because at the end of the day, scale matters. And China is growing 5% a year. A lot of people tell me that you should invest in Vietnam or you should invest in Thailand. And both of those countries are great. But if China continues to grow at just 5% a year, that's like adding an entire Thailand and an entire Vietnam economy together. The scale matters. China is the next China. No other country, no other market in the world, except for maybe India, can potentially rival China for the growth potential over the next 3 to 5 year period. And even then, India is slowing down. Their GDP this quarter is only 6.7%, way below original forecast of 7 or 8%, because India is dealing with massive inflation that's crimping the spending of its middle class. And I think at the end of the day, if your company, read my book like The Split, talk to other consultants, talk to your people on the ground. No, should you invest in China? The answer is yes. If you're a company like Hoka, if you're a company like Zara, if you're a company like Starbucks, it's 2 thumbs down and a no. If you're a company like Qualcomm or if you're a company like Intel, it's no longer the China story. It's the China story and how does it fit your specific sector and your specific business.
One of the persons I've interviewed in the past few episodes was Kenneth. Kenneth was the former CEO of McDonald's China. So he shared a little bit with me about how McDonald's grew in China. Back then, I think the competition was primarily amongst the Western entrants into the market. So you had Starbucks, you had KFC entering China with the trying to compete on the casual dining concept. But more recently, I think we started to see more competitors coming out of the China consumer space. We think about maybe the bigger names that come to mind is like your Luckin Coffees of the world. So then it begs the question, if you're a foreign company entering China in that space, how much more competitive is it going to be in your view?
Well, I know this sector very well. Yum China has been one of my biggest clients since 2008. So we've been working on the strategy for KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut for almost 2 decades now. I think when we first started helping Yum, we were indeed looking more at the Western brands as competitors. But over the last 5-10 years, when we're looking at SWOT analysis or competitor analysis, we've really been looking more and more at what some of the Chinese players are doing. A company like you mentioned, which would be a Luckin. So there's still a great opportunity for Western fast food brands and dining to come in, but they have to create a strong brand image, have right food, have authenticity that really fit what the Chinese consumer wants. And that's why KFC is doing so well, and which is something that local players can't do as easily. Now you have Bicos, which is emerging on fried chicken, but still Chinese can tell the difference between a KFC chicken and chicken from Bicos, which is why in the short, medium, and long term, I'm still bullish on a company like KFC. But when you cut to a company like Starbucks, I think they're in a lot of trouble in China. They really have one product, coffee. They haven't done very well in food. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's something like 90% of their revenue comes from a coffee or coffee-like drink. And the problem for them is Chinese can't tell if their coffee is actually better than the competitor. Chinese put in a lot of sugar, they put in a lot of milk, and frankly, I don't think Starbucks coffee is that good anyway, and I love coffee. But Chinese in this weak economic environment are looking to trade down. So think Luckin Coffee over Starbucks. Right now, Luckin has, I think, almost double the number of points of sale in China than Starbucks. They offer a product that's a half, sometimes even a third of the price of what Starbucks is offering. And again, Chinese consumers can't really tell the difference. I think, I've been very bearish on Starbucks for several years now. And you've seen that they've had a lot of management turnover. They just changed their global CEO. They had to pull back their China CEO, who had previously semi-retired. Steve left. They're doing all kinds of rotations right now. Because I think Starbucks doesn't have a competitive advantage over Chinese players, which I think a company like KFC has. But there's still good opportunities in the China market. I mean, you see, even with the weak luxury sentiment and companies like Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Burberry are getting smacked hard, their sales are plummeting. You saw that Ralph Lauren, Abercrombie and Fitch, which are both not cheap, especially Ralph Lauren, posted amazing revenue numbers this past quarter in China because they were able to capture the low-key, classy, luxury look, preppy look that Chinese consumers want right now. And it has a good quality product. So there's still great opportunities here, despite the weak environment, despite the geopolitical tension, for foreign brands to expand in China, even American ones.
A lot of the Chinese consumer sentiments or patterns have changed maybe because of nationalism, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'll use some numbers. Okay, in 2011, my firm, I run a market research firm. We interviewed 5,000 consumers in 15 cities. At the time, 85% of consumers said they would always buy a foreign brand over a local brand. 85%. This is when brands like Zara, Nike, Adidas were booming in the China market. In 2016, we replicated the research, and this time 60% of consumers said they would always buy a local brand over a foreign brand when it was similar quality. And this is when you saw companies like Haier, Meiji, and Greed in the white goods started destroying Siemens and Samsung for refrigerators, air conditioners, washing machines. In 2021, because of COVID, I couldn't go to 15 cities, but we did some online stats. And at this time, 90% of consumers said they would always buy a local brand over a foreign brand. And this is when you saw companies like Anka and Li Ning emerge very strongly to defeat Nike. Nike is plummeting right now. They're in a lot of trouble in the China market. So Chinese customers started to want to buy Chinese brands out of patriotism, but B, more and more key, because of the weak economy, they just want a good deal. They want good value. And the Chinese brands are cheaper and better than the foreign brands right now. Like, if you look in cars, why would you buy a BMW or a Mercedes or a Volkswagen when you can buy a Neo or a Xinjiang or a BYD for 10 to 30% cheaper for a car that's just as good, if not better, than from the traditional legacy automakers? So I think going forward is the continued rise of the Chinese brand. Chinese brands made for China by Chinese. However, here's the cool part. The Chinese now don't want to expand in Western Europe. They don't want to expand in the United States because they're scared about geopolitical tension. They're worried that if a company like TikTok can get thrown out of Canada by Justin Trudeau, which he did last week, just because he didn't call it a national security threat without any evidence, they're worried that could happen if they invest billions into the United States or Western Europe. So what you're going to see is more Chinese companies are going to go to your stores. You're going to see more Chinese companies are going to go to the global south. They're going to go to Singapore. This will be companies like Luckin. This will be companies like Pop Mart. This will be companies like Haidilao Hot Pot. So the world, especially Southeast Asia first, and then the Middle East second, to get ready to see Chinese brands spreading out throughout the world. And they're as good, if not better, than the Western brands, and they're at a much better price point. You know, I used to use Apple iPhones. I switched, and I'm now using Xiaomi because it's half the price of an Apple, and I think it's just as good, if not better.
Yeah, in fact, Xpeng just opened up in Singapore, I think, in the past 2 months. So they have a flagship store here. Earlier this year, I went to Shanghai and Beijing. How many of the TT or how many of those taxis are now fully electric, in the sense that you literally can walk on the road full of cars and it's completely like silent, right? You don't have the kind of noise pollution that you had maybe 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Much quieter now. Actually, over 50% of car sales in China this year were new energy vehicles. And aside from Tesla, it's the only Chinese companies dominate the market. That's one of the reasons why the air is so much better right now. I wish I could turn the camera around, but I'm looking at blue sky in front of me, which is a vision that I would not have had 10 years ago when pollution was a major drag on the quality of life of every Chinese citizen in the 2010s. Now,
We saw the sudden rise or emergence of Chinese electric vehicles. If you were to ask people like about 6, 7 years ago, would Chinese EVs dominate the markets? Not just the Western market where it's posing a significant threat to the incumbents, but the global market generally. Most people would dismiss you, but suddenly now they've come up to prominence. And one of the questions that I had for you was that what explains this rise of their dominance in such a competitive space?
it's funny you say that because right before COVID happened, I met with the global CEO. I don't want to say which one of the major legacy automakers from the United States. And I told him, look, NVs are going to become big in China. And he didn't really think so. He said, yeah, I think any electric vehicles are going to be fairly minor. It's going to only be for luxury players. He spent all this time talking to me about whether or not Chinese consumers would want to have electric screens or electric dashboards in their cars. He wasn't interested in the whole NEV revolution, which clearly was happening in China. Now, as to your question of why, I think there's a couple of these. One, the Chinese government wanted to dominate standards, right? It's a superpower. When you are a superpower, you want to dominate and be able to enforce and implement global technology standards. And nobody controlled the standards for electric vehicles. So China wanted to take the lead on that. If China could be the standard charger, if they could have the standard batteries, if they could be the number one player in electric vehicles, that would allow China to control the globe. So they put a lot of subsidies and a lot of support for the rise of the domestic NEV sector. That's number one. Number two, as we said, pollution was awful in China. And so they wanted to really limit the number of ICE or internal combustion engine vehicles on the street. So if you want to buy a car here and you want it to be a combustible engine, it's actually very difficult to get a license plate. Only about 4 or 5% of people get it in an option system in Shanghai, and it costs $15,000 to $20,000 US. But if you buy a new energy vehicle, the license plate is guaranteed and it's free. So naturally, a lot of consumers just said, well, it's much easier and cheaper to buy an NEV. So I'm just going to buy that. And they don't need to spend the $15,000 on getting a license plate for a regular combustible engine car. So I think those are the two reasons. The government supported it because they knew long term this was going to be a technological standard that China could dominate in globally. They wanted to reduce pollution, and so they wanted to get NEV vehicles onto the street.
You've painted a very bullish picture, but at the same time, I can't help but remember of the collapse of Evergrande as well, right? Because they tried to venture into EV as well. There have been some structural problems with the Chinese economy. So my question is that are there like headwinds that we should be kind of taking note of in the background of our mind, even as we understand or try to understand the Chinese economy?
Absolutely. I mean, the economy here is weak. I'm not painting a positive picture here. Let me be very clear. I've only been nervous about the economy twice in my 27 years in China. The first was in October 2022 when we were dealing with zero COVID implementation. That was sometimes chaotic. I was taking 5 COVID tests a day. At the time, consumers were scared to go to a restaurant because they were worried that their kid would be called a close contact as a close contact and be sent away to a quarantine hospital. There's a lot of anxiety and frustration in October 2022. The second time I've been very stressed out was August of this year, for a number of the reasons, right? The first was the geopolitical tension that we discussed. So what you found is a lot of the movers and shakers in China said, you know what? We've already made our money. We're not going to invest in China anymore. We're going to take a wait and see attitude on the political win, the geopolitical one, as well as domestic win, and see, is there a place for rich people in China anymore? Can we make money? So I think the first problem, Keith, is that a lot of the movers and shakers in China have lost their animal spirit. So there isn't a lot of startup. There's very little venture capital investment. Movers and shakers have lost their animal spirit. That's number one. Number two, The real estate sector has been hit really hard. And you can see that, there's a direct link between consumer spending and real estate prices. And real estate prices have dropped 10 to 30% in the last couple of years. So a lot of consumers are scared because they see their nest egg evaporating in front of their very eyes. So that's why you see, and I've mentioned before, that sales have plummeted for companies like Starbucks, companies like Nike, companies like Burberry, companies like Gucci, because the economy and consumer confidence is really weak right now. A, because of geopolitics, like I said, and B, because of real estate. So don't get me wrong, there's great opportunities in China, but the economy is definitely weak. And we're going to probably need more fiscal stimulus and maybe some monetary policy stimulus in the coming months on the incremental side in order to avert too much of a slowdown, especially if Trump does indeed slap 60% tariff on China, because that will obviously have an impact on economic growth in China over the next 4 years. So don't get me wrong, China is still the next China. If you're a multinational, you should be thinking long and hard about whether or not you should be in China. Over the medium to long term, China is good. But in the short term, there's a lot of weakness in the economy right now.
Is this a problem that's primarily concentrated in tier 1 cities? Because I think when you look at the tier 3 cities, for example, where there's been a lot of infrastructure investment, there's been a lot of investment in just improving the training of the workers. Maybe compared to 10 years ago, their standard of living has drastically improved. But maybe this is underreported in Western media where, your tier 3 cities, maybe because they're far out, they're not as accessible, they don't speak as much English. This story gets underreported. So I wanted to ask you, is this weak economy issue, is it systemic across the whole of China, or is it really mainly in the tier 1 cities that you really have to understand?
Very question, too. So the weakness is throughout the whole country, but there's definitely far more weakness in the tier 1 cities. So when you go into the tier 1 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, the consumer confidence is really dropping. Amongst the wealthy people in the whole country, it's dropping. What I call the 10% of the country in my book, The Split. The 10% of the country account for about 60% of overall consumption, and they're definitely hit harder. And now let's be honest, when the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg reports on China, they typically are interviewing people in the tier 1 city. They're typically interviewing people in the 10%. And so they report that there's a lot of negativity and a lot of anxiety. And that's truthful. But unfortunately, the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg don't dig deeper. They don't go deep into China like I do. My firm has mostly been in third, fourth, fifth tier cities in the last 6 to 12 months. And consumer confidence there is much better. They love Xi Jinping. They love the party. They're not concerned about the crackdowns on tech, the crackdowns on the finance sector like the wealthier Chinese are. They feel that because of Xi Jinping's common prosperity drive, the quality of life in third, fourth, fifth tier cities is definitely getting better. So when we're working with our clients, we've actually are advising them, don't invest in tier 1 cities right now. You want to go into cities, in Henan province, in Hunan, Tibet, in Xinjiang, where there's a lot of growth, in cities that probably most journalists working for Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal have never heard of. And that also brings up just one little my own side pick. A lot of these journalists don't speak Chinese. I mean, I've seen, people based in China as foreign correspondents for 5-10 years, and they can barely, if at all, order a coffee in a restaurant in Chinese. They're simply just not qualified. And this is at the best publications like The Economist, or so-called bet publications. They like The Economist, like the New York Times, and I've seen Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, people who've won Pulitzer Prizes for their stories on China, and they don't speak a word of Chinese. So I think most people are getting a very skewed vision of how China's economy is developing. Definitely tier 1 cities have been impacted by the slowdown far more than third, fourth, fifth tier cities.
I can't help but ask this question about Xinjiang, because you've been to Xinjiang yourself and you've really investigated what's happening there from from a traveler's perspective. So what I wanted to ask you was, can you help us understand, what's really going on in Xinjiang? Because this is something that I think Western media kind of covers, but in a very politically charged lens.
All I can say, all I can say, Keith, is you and all of your viewers should go visit Xinjiang. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. The people are super friendly. So as I said in the beginning, I'm half Chinese, half Jewish. I look like I'm a Uyghur. I look like I'm a local Xinjiang person. So I love it. It's one of the few places in the world where I feel like I'm welcomed. When I'm in the United States, people think I'm Chinese. When I'm in Shanghai, people think I'm a white person from America. It's only in Xinjiang that people come up and start talking to me in the local language. I absolutely love it. Now, I've spent a month, over 3 trips traveling around the country. I went to cotton fields. I went to factories. I didn't see any evidence of forced labor. I certainly didn't see evidence of genocide. You got to remember, I think this is highly politically charged. 20% of the world's cotton comes from Xinjiang. Most of the solar panels where China's dominating the lead-in also come from Xinjiang. So most Chinese, and myself too, believe that all of these allegations leveled on forced labor and genocide is pure political machinations by the Western world to try to contain China. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't policies that might be ham-fisted, that might be heavy-handed, that you could criticize. There's definitely some that I saw that I didn't like. For example, there was an 18-year-old girl who wanted to take my son and me to her home village and show us around. And then afterwards, she's like, you know what? I don't want to do it. It's too difficult. If I take you to the home village, I have to report to the local government authorities that I have a visitor. So any visitors that I have that come to my village, I have to report. Now, to me, that's annoying, right? If we ever go make bread in Singapore and I go visit your house, I don't think you're going to have to report to the local authority that I'm visiting you. I don't think this girl should have to report if I visited her home village. I don't think that's right. That's not genocide, though. That's not forced labor. That's a government that was very scared of terrorism because there were a lot of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang from independence movements and from organizations that ironically, the United States before Trump had actually called a terrorist organization. And they were closely involved with the Taliban and some of the fighters in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. So for most Chinese, it doesn't make any sense, some of these allegations. All I'll say is go visit. You'll have a great time. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. And ask questions. Anybody can go there. It's not closed off. What I will say is the people who've made the allegations haven't been to Xinjiang in 10 years. So are you going to trust someone like me who's been on the ground or somebody who's living in DC?
I think in Singapore as well, I previously heard a lecture by our ex-foreign minister, George Yeo, and he was talking about the same issue as well, that I think a lot of the more muscular policies that we see, it's really an effort to kind of contain more of the radical Islamic thought that's kind of taken hold of some of the Uyghurs living in Xinjiang. Another question I had was on the issue of innovation. I was curious to know about how you saw Alibaba's rise as not just an e-commerce enabler, but also in the way that there is a certain dark side that most people don't understand. Because a lot of people see the tech crackdown in China as something as, like the government being kind of offended by Jack Ma's comments. But I think there is a deeper story behind that, which is that in some cases, they might have consolidated too much market power. Maybe could you just elaborate on how they've kind of consolidated that much market power and what were the regulatory reasons as to why the government decided to intervene in Alibaba?
Sure. Going back to George Yeo, I was the open luncheon keynote speaker for Citi's annual conference last year, and George was the closing keynote luncheon speaker. And I think he had a lot of good words to say about China. He's very balanced. And I think we need to underscore just how much terrorism and how much violence there was in Xinjiang 10, 15 years ago. And the government needed to crack down. And I think that the crackdown was portrayed in a very negative light in the Western media, but I think it was exaggerated, sensationalized, and took too much of a negative turn. Just like what you see with what's happening in Hong Kong. In the Hong Kong riot in 2019, I interviewed people while they were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. They took over the Hong Kong airport. So any country, any government in the world would arrest the people who did that type of thing and give them several year jail sentences. Let's not forget what the Americans did to the January 6th Capitol Hill rioters, where they gave some of those people 20-year prison sentences, which are even longer than anything that was meted out to the Hong Kong rioters. Now, in terms of the tech crackdown, I was talking with the founder of a hedge fund in the United States, one of the most famous investors in the world, billionaire. And he had made a lot of money with Alibaba's riot. And after the crackdown of Alibaba on Alibaba in the tech sector, he lost billions of dollars. And he was angry. He said to me, Shaun, China's uninvestable. I will never invest in China again. And so I wrote the book, The Split, to sort of educate investors like this hedge fund founder about why there was a crackdown. It wasn't because Jack Ma was becoming too powerful and was posing a political threat to Xi Jinping himself. That's ridiculous. It was because Alibaba especially was throttling innovation. It was stifling innovation in the country. It was stifling the margins for merchants, stifling the fair choice for everyday consumers. What Alibaba would do is they would say to brands, if you want to sell on our platform, you can't sell on other platforms. Now, that obviously isn't good for anyone except for Alibaba and their investors. So I think China had to crack down on Alibaba to help promote a lively innovation ecosystem. And you've seen the rise of Little Dragon. You've seen Douyin rise, Pinduoduo rise, Meituan rise, Xiaohongshu rise. And they've become massive multi-billion-dollar companies on their own, which I don't think they would have been able to if they had been squelched and forced to be part of the Alibaba or Tencent ecosystem. So I wrote The Split to help investors understand, let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's go deeper than what you get in the Wall Street Journal. Let's go deeper than what you get in Bloomberg and really understand why the government acts the way it does. Now, I think criticism of how the government cracked down is fair. It came too quick. It wasn't well communicated. It cut too far to the bone. It scared everybody for a good 1 year period. But at the end of the day, the reasons for the crackdown were correct. It helped promote innovation, margins, and fair competition, and better choice for the end consumer. So hopefully, if your audience reads the book, The Split, they're going to understand why sometimes China acts as it does, sometimes too heavy-handed. Let's be honest on that. But usually they come from a good heart, something that's good for the majority of China.
What I got away from it was that there are a lot of nuances of the Chinese economy that get lost once it's in the mainstream media. I think partly because what you shared earlier, with that there might be a bias, but there's also another layer, which is like what you shared also, which is that these reporters might not understand China in a way a native might, and that's where your story should really come through. And I would recommend this to my friends to read as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you recommending people to read. It's meant to be an easy read. It's meant to be informative, so you learn something and you can take away 3, 4, 5 things. But it's also meant to be something you can read on an airplane. It's not full of jargon. It's not dense like a typical professor book. It's meant to be easily accessible. Read on an airplane, read on the beach. I want you to have fun with it.
The last question I have for you would be, what is that one piece of advice that you give to someone who's just starting out today?
Take risks. Don't go the easy route. In my experience, it's important to find a good mentor and just do what you want to do. Start that company, start that podcast. Don't be scared, because if all else fails, you can always go get an MBA. You can always go back and start another company. You can always get a job at a larger company. I think your 20s is a time for exploration, for having fun, and at the end of the day, take the risk. I've seen too many people say they're going to work hard in high school to get in the right college, and then they work hard in college to get the right job at Goldman Sachs, and then they work hard at Goldman Sachs to get into the right business school like Harvard, then at Harvard work hard. It's never ending. You can't follow the ladder. Go out, forge your own way, be passionate, and take risks. I was 27 years old when I started my company, TMR. 27. I've never really worked for anybody else anywhere. I worked for 6 months or a year here and there, but I've basically been an entrepreneur my entire life. It's stressful. Sometimes I wonder how my cash flow is going to be in the coming month. I got to pay the bill, but I wouldn't give up my job and I wouldn't give up being an entrepreneur for any employed position anywhere else. Take risk. Thank you so much for having me, Keith. Thank you so much to your audience. I hope they found this interesting. And Ring the Split go out globally December 5th.
Thanks, Shaun. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, click on the video that's appearing on the screen right now.